down here. So if I could, I'm going to hand over the floor to you, and on behalf of everyone who is joined us today and will join us in the future when we watch online. Our numbers tend to grow incrementally once we publish on YouTube. I would say thank you, Don, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me first?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. And my apologies if I couldn't hear others earlier. I was having issues with my headset, but I can hear now. So if someone was trying to talk to me and I didn't respond, it's because I was unable to hear. I'm just wondering, would it be possible to share for me to be able to share the screen because I have a PowerPoint. Um,
There we go. I think I've done it correctly, Don. If I haven't,
okay. Yeah.
shout. And may I ask for all of our guests today to turn your cameras and microphones off during the presentation, and after Don's completed it, we'll ask you to raise them again.
Well, thanks again for the invitation to speak today. So this comes out of work that I've been doing for I think over 10 years now, amongst other projects. But this has really been the principal area of my academic work for a while, and it actually began when I was at Cape Breton University. I'm at McGill now with holding the Canadian Scottish Studies chair in the Department of History here. Um, and so I'm delivering the talk sort of with the assumption also that you don't necessarily know anything about Nova Scotia, about Cape Breton, which in many ways is a unique history, and that's something that I hope to get into over the next 40, 50 minutes or so. Um, by the early 20th century, Cape Breton Island Sydney coalfield had become Canada's most important site of coal production, with vast underground mining works already extending beneath floor. And here on this slide, you see the location of Cape Breton Island, and more particularly, I have the arrow there, which is indicating the location of the Sydney coal field to help orient ourselves. And coal raised from the mines was loaded onto steamship that traveled hundreds of miles up the St. Lawrence to Montreal, where belching smokestacks and low-hanging clouds evince the centrality of coal in Montreal's industrial life. In addition to millions of tons of coal that flowed to Montreal, the mines fueled a steel plant at nearby Sydney in Cape Breton. And I have a few slides here. So this is an image from the coal fields around this period. Here is a map showing the shipping route from Sydney to Montreal, was the major route for the shipment of a great deal of the coal that was being mined. Here's an image of Montreal's cityscape from this period. So of course, note the smoke, the predominance of coal in this economy. And finally, the steel plant in Cape Breton, which is at Sydney, so near the coal mines, that is constructed at the turn of the century and becomes a major consumer uh, of the coal that is being mined during this period. So the period of the early 19th uh, or late 19th, early 20th century is a period of rapid transformation. Um, but industrial Cape Breton's burgeoning mines and steel industries also drew in laborers from far and wide. They arrived from Central and Southern Europe, from the Caribbean, from Newfoundland, and from Britain, among other places, contributing to the making of industrial Cape Breton as a decidedly multi-ethnic and multi-racial community. This spate of expansionism also drew large numbers of migrants from the Cape Breton countryside, which reinforced the distinctive Highland character of the coal communities that had developed in the 19th century. The establishment of a Gaelic language newspaper at Sydney, Mactala, in 1892 suggested the impact of this rural migration to the country of coal. The demographic significance of the Highland element in industrial Cape Breton contributed to the making of a distinct working class culture. Reference to the clearances and Culloden were not uncommon in the speeches of labor leaders and were part of a variegated Scottish tradition that had become embedded in local life by the time of the labor wars of the 1920s, when the miners engaged in a series of bitter strikes against the British Empire Steel Corporation, a vast corporate enterprise that commanded Cape Breton's coal mines and steel plant. As the historian David Frank has written, quote, "The Scottish tradition presented itself as a generalized cultural resource in the mining community, which was freely drawn upon to not only for entertainment, but also for cultural and moral judgments regarding the events of the 1920s." End quote. In Cape Breton today, the inclusion of a bagpiper in a protest march or labor event is not considered altogether remarkable. The rise of industrial Cape Breton was accompanied by a unique assimilation of Highland cultural traditions into a generalized working class culture that became an important element in the construction of a Cape Breton identity in the 20th century. The Cape Breton case in many ways is distinctive. Nowhere else does this cultural fusion occur quite as it did there. So in my talk today, I really want to investigate what factors cause this unique cultural transmission to occur in Cape Breton. And what I want to argue is that in many ways, the origins of this story can be located in the 19th century. My talk today will focus, of course, on the Scottish factor in shaping Cape Breton's coal communities, and we will encounter some lowland influences in this story. As elsewhere in North America, including in Illinois, migrants from Scotland are often arrived as skilled colliers um, and assumed important roles. And this was happening in Cape Breton as well. And they often assumed important roles within the mining communities. A notable example of this is J.B. McLaughlin, a Scottish coal miner who arrived in Cape Breton from the coal fields of Lanarkshire at the turn of the 20th century and participated in the establishment of District 26 of the United Mine Workers of America in Cape Breton. And he operated as a very important public figure within industrial Cape Breton. For anyone interested in this story, I would recommend David Frank's biography of McLaughlin, which has been recently reissued. But our principal focus today will be specifically on the Highland factor, which demographically was more important than the lowland influence in the making of Cape Breton's mining communities. In explaining the origins of this unique factor in Cape Breton's mining history, I tell a story that combines the history of the clearances with the histories of industrialism and settler colonialism in northern North America. It is a story that shows an adaptation to industrialism among working people that generated a powerful basis for popular agency that carried important consequences into the 20th century. So I'm trained as a historian, and I like narratives, and I'll be delivering my material today using some themes, but also telling a story that really runs through the 19th century. And here is sort of the outline of the subjects that we'll be looking at. We'll begin by examining the making of a colonial countryside in the first half of the 19th century that would eventually supply the mines with its principal labor force. Next, we examine The coal boom of the 1860s, which was characterized by the arrival of significant numbers of Highland Scots from rural Cape Breton to the coal mining district, and was accompanied by growing social conflict. Third, I trace the origins of a miners' union in the 19th century, the Provincial Workmen's Association, or PWA. And next, we'll explore the unique transition to industrialism that occurred on the Sydney coalfield, the mythologies that have surrounded it, and what is suggested by the historical evidence. And then I'll wrap up with some closing thoughts on the legacies of this history in Cape Breton. So let's get started. First, some general context. Cape Breton Island composes the northeastern extremity of the province of Nova Scotia, encompassing a portion of the territories and wider homeland of the Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kmaqi. Cape Breton is also known as Unama'ki, meaning land of the fog. By the 17th century, the island was becoming subject to competing European commercial ambitions. Designated by the French crown as Ile Royale, in the 18th century, it became the site on the eastern coast of the island of Fortress Louisbourg. This French fortress at the entrance of the Gulf of St. Lawrence played a considerable strategic and commercial role within France's Atlantic Empire. After it fell to British forces in 1758 during the Seven Years' War, the fortress was destroyed. Following the American Revolution in 1784, Cape Breton became an independent British colony established to facilitate the settlement of political refugees of the Revolution, the Loyalists. But migration to the island remained limited until after the Napoleonic Wars, and Cape Breton was reabsorbed into Nova Scotia in 1820. Highland migration to Cape Breton commenced as a trickle early in the century, the first ship arriving direct from Scotland in 1802, before the explosion of the 1820s and 1830s occasioned by the collapse of the kelping industry and clearances in the Hebrides. At its height in the late 1820s, early 1830s, more Highland Scots arrived in Cape Breton than anywhere else in North America. All told, between the early 1800s and the early 1840s, about 20,000 migrants arrived in Cape Breton from the Hebrides and Western Highlands. Potato blight in the second half of the 1840s in Cape Breton brought social crisis and marked the close of the period of mass migration to the island. By 1871, when the first census was taken following Nova Scotia's entry into Confederation as a province under the Dominion of Canada, two-thirds of Cape Breton's total population of 75,000 was identified as Scottish. And of this population, 87% was born in Nova Scotia, right? So this is indicating not only the sort of Scottishness of the population, but also by the time you get to the 1870s, it's a population that has moved into its second and third generations in Cape Breton. By the middle years of the 19th century, group and chain migration from the Western Highlands and Hebrides produced a patchwork of Highland enclave settlements within Cape Breton's expanding countryside. These settlements reassembled kin and community and became the basis for the persistence of Gaelic culture in the 19th century, and is still evidenced today by Cape Breton's designation as a Gaeltacht region. A significant portion of the migrant stream that arrived in Cape Breton were Catholics. Some of the earliest Highland migrants to the region, such as the migration party led by John MacDonald of Gleneldale to St. John's Island in 1772, just across the Northumberland Strait from Cape Breton, at the center of the map here. Many of these migrants were Catholics seeking to maintain religious practices that were threatened by anti-Catholic lairds in Scotland. And actually, the earliest Highland migration to Cape Breton was not direct from Scotland, but came from St. John's Island, which was renamed in 1798 Prince Edward Island. And this arrow is showing that flow from Prince Edward Island to Cape Breton. Such remigration was indicative of a rejection of the system of tenant farming that had been installed on Prince Edward Island, which surely conjured bitter memories of the ongoing experience in the Highlands. Freehold tenure, a possibility in Cape Breton, was a decided preference among Highland migrants. While Highland Catholics faced persecution in Scotland, in Nova Scotia and other parts of British North America, they enjoyed greater religious freedom. The institutional presence of the Catholic Church was bolstered by the creation of a separate diocese for northeastern Nova Scotia in 1844 and the establishment of St. Francis Xavier College in the 1850s at Antigonish, which is the location of which is circled on this map. Antigonish later became the center of the diocese. Located on the Nova Scotia mainland, it was situated amidst a zone of almost contiguous Highland settlement that extended up to Inverness County, the western side of Cape Breton Island. In 19th century Cape Breton, Highland in 19th century Cape Breton, Highland Catholics were co-religionists with Mi'kmaq people as well as with Irish and Acadian settlers, but their overall numbers elevated the Scottish Catholic character of the Diocese of Antigonish. As the historian Carly Kehoe has argued, Highland Catholics in British North America gained access to a system that both provided a new space for Catholic institutions and often provided Highland migrants with access to land. As such, Highlanders became not only participants, but leading actors in a history of settler colonialism that was based upon the taking of Mi'kmaq land and resources. The dispossessed became dispossessors, an important and well-documented historical reality that also needs to be registered. Yet, prosperity eluded many Highland settlers. As clearances swept through the Hebrides, migrants after the mid-1820s often arrived with limited resources and limited ability to access land. They often established homesteads in backlands settlements. In Cape Breton, the backlands distinguished remote upland settlements from better situated farms in river valleys and select coastal locations, known as the frontlands. The designation backlander not only signaled one's geographical location within this configuration, it also designated one's position within the social order. This was a rural society characterized by economic differentiation and stratification. While some Highland settlers profited from commercial agriculture in Cape Breton that had been a source of dislocation and displacement in Scotland, many did not. Indeed, poverty led to widespread squatting. As late as 1857, an estimated two-thirds of the settler population in Cape Breton County was in fact squatting. Reverend James A. Ritchie of Gabarus declared before the Sydney Mechanics Institute in 1862 that, quote, in 9 out of 10 cases, you will find that our immigrant squatter is from the land of the thistle, and more frequently, one of the Western Islands has been his home. Economic inequities within the settler population not only produced greater pressure upon land and resources, it also heightened social conflict with Mi'kmaq people. In addition to this, it also meant that settlers in the backlands typically needed to sell their labor in order to survive on marginal farmlands. Second part, the coal boom. When James Ritchie lamented the condition of the emigrant squatter in 1862, the Sydney coalfield was undergoing a rapid phase of expansion. the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854, and the impact of the American Civil War elevated the demand of major centers along the northeastern seaboard, such as New York and Boston, for Nova Scotia coal. Moreover, the General Mining Association's monopoly lease over Nova Scotia's coal resources was ended in 1858, and thus the coal field was opened to investment. The resultant boom produced a sudden emergence of new coal mining villages along the coast across the harbor from the General Mining Association's principal colliery at Sydney Mines. And the circled area on this map is showing the zone where you see the rapid expansion of new mines after the General Mining Association's monopoly is ended in 1858. Specifically, Little Glace Bay and Cow Bay become important centers. Lingan was the site of a General Mining Association colliery that had been opened in 1854. And you can see on the left-hand side, Sydney Mines is on the opposite side of Sydney Harbor. So oftentimes, this circled area is just described as the south side of the Sydney coalfield, although it's not technically due south. An important factor in the boom that we begin to see in the 1860s was the availability of labor that was being produced by the flow of migrants from backland settlements to the mines. In addition to the long-standing demographic and economic pressures in the countryside, the Nova Scotia government, acting under new legislation, sought to compel squatters in the backlands to take out and pay for land grants. This new interventionism was met with concern among squatters who lacked the means to pay for grants and was an additional factor encouraging migrations for work at the mines during the 1860s. As the Deputy Commissioner of Crown Lands reported in 1865, quote, "The poorer class of farmers in Cape Breton Island, among whom the squatters rank, are rarely, if ever, paid in cash for their produce." End quote. Among such people, wage labor was a potential means to raise money to pay for land grants. Collectively, these factors brought significant numbers of rural migrants to the mines, as Highlanders from the backlands became the major component of a semi-proletarianized labor force. In his analysis of evidence from the 1871 Census of Canada, the historian Del Muse found, quote, "the almost universal overrepresentation of native-born Scottish Roman Catholics, and to a lesser extent, Presbyterians, in all the low-status occupations in what was becoming industrial Cape Breton." Um, in the Glace Bay area, several mines were opened nearby the General Mining Association's mine at Lingan. And here, Scottish Gaels arriving from the countryside helped to produce a plurality of Catholics, bolstered by an established Irish population in the locality. By contrast, Cow Bay, so east of Little Glace Bay, where two colliers were established, developed essentially as a Presbyterian enclave. Edith Archibald, wife of the mine manager of one of these mines, emphasized the religious zeal of Presbyterian Gaels in the vicinity of Cow Bay in a novel she published decades after her time in Cow Bay. One of the factors that was also promoting this migration was that work at the mines, the evidence suggests that it was almost universally preferred to work on someone else's farm as a farmhand, as a rural laborer. And you also see this migration as part of a seasonal flow connected to farming, characterized by the arrival to the mines in the spring and departures at harvest time in late August or early September. Here's a image of the coal mining village at Cow Bay that was published in the Canadian Illustrated News. So just to give you a picture of what some of these new mining villages in the 19th century look like. The migration that we see in the 1860s, though, was not entirely new. Until the 1820s, the Colonial Office had limited the development of the Sydney mines by restricting leases to short terms of no more than 7 years, which was really impeding investment. This policy changed with the arrival of the General Mining Association, or GMA, in Nova Scotia. Through a series of events that originated with King George III's spendthrift son, the Duke of York, and his heavy indebtedness to a London jewelry firm, this London-based company received a monopoly lease on Nova Scotia's coal resources. With this monopoly lease in hand, in the early 1830s, the GMA installed a railway and steam engine to accompany the development of the room and pillar system of mining at Sydney Mines. Another aspect of this new program of development was recruitment of skilled miners from Britain. But analysis of surnames from the company's time books for Sydney Mines suggests that Highland migrants to Cape Breton served an important role as itinerant laborers at the mines from this early period. A sample from the July 1839 time books suggests that Highlanders represented over 70% of the coal fillers, banksmen, and laborers at the mines, but only around 10% of the proper colliers. In other words, they were overrepresented within the lower rungs of the mining labor force, but barely represented among the proper miners. And if you look at the names on this time book, you can see names that are clearly connected to the Highland diaspora. Especially for people who might be familiar with the names that reappear in Cape Breton and are quite common: Macaulay, Nicholson, MacDonald, McKinnon. And one of the other things that provides a clue as to the number of people participating in this work is that you'll note in some instances there are numbers next to names, which is suggesting that, so for instance, in the case of John MacDonald, you can see that John MacDonald sixth. So that's telling us that there were 6 John MacDonalds working for the General Mining Association around 1839. Interestingly, these time books have also been used by scholars to study nicknaming practices in industrial Cape Breton. The time books in the second half of the 19th century, you begin to see the replacement of this numbering system with the use of nicknames to differentiate workers with the same names. But this all shows the massive participation of Highlanders in mining. Well, intermarriage played a role in assimilating settler families from mining and rural backgrounds at Sydney Mines by the middle years of the 19th century. Increased migration from the countryside to the mines was a source of heightened social conflict. The coal boom of the 1860s produced the first of what would become a series of major strikes over a 2-decade-long period. The first of these confrontations occurred at Sydney Mines in 1864. After the miners took over the engines responsible for pumping water out of the colliery and assumed control of the pithead in early May, the mine manager sent an urgent telegram to Halifax, quote, requesting that a body of troops be dispatched for the purpose of restoring the owner's representatives' possession of the works, end quote. A force of 100 soldiers from the 17th Regiment arrived in Sydney from Halifax on 15 May 1864 and encamped at Sydney Mines. In Cape Breton, the regiment was placed under the authority of the acting magistrate and assemblyman for Inverness County, Samuel MacDonnell, who a couple days later oversaw the ejectments of strike ringleaders from company houses. A local Anglican minister, Reverend Meek, went to the mines to see the colliers and their families at the times of their removal from the company houses. Meek recorded the painful scene. Quote, "The women and children crying, many of whom without a home to go to, awakened at last to the consciousness of their inability to resist the power brought against them." End quote. A month later, Meek lamented that his congregates had left Sydney mines and that their places had been filled by, quote, "Gaelic people from the country, mostly Roman Catholics," end quote. The recruitment of rural migrants for work at the mines became a source of bitter conflict in this period. A local song from this general period, titled the Yahi Miners, presented Gaelic-speaking migrants who traveled back and forth between rural home communities and the mines as outsiders and blacklegs as strikebreakers. Linked to the events from a strike at Lingan 2 decades later, but no doubt informed by the longer period of social conflict beginning in the 1860s, the song was an adaptation of an earlier English song, the Blackleg Miners, from the 1844 Durham and Northumberland lockout. Yahi was an English corruption of the Gaelic word for home, as in the phrase Hami Adol Yahi, I'm going home. Gaelic-speaking migrants to the mines, the Yahis, are demeaned in the song and presented as outsiders to the coal community. And I'll just read a portion from the song. Early in the month of May, when the ice has gone away, the Yahis, they come down to work with their white bags and dirty shirts, the dirty Yahi miners. End quote. The song goes on from there to make invocations to join the Union and endorses direct action and violence against those who defy the Union miners. Highlanders working at the mines, of course, operated within a structural context not of their own making. And in the transition from rural to industrial environments, old hierarchies were adapted to new purposes. Reminiscent of arrangements imposed in the crofting townships of the Hebrides earlier in the century, the General Mining Association reportedly offered mine workers free potato patches as a supplement to facilitate the payment of exceptionally low wages in Cape Breton. Religious authority was an especially powerful source of social control at the mines. The local Catholic priest and Presbyterian minister, both figures embedded in the composite Highland communities reassembled at the mines, collected non-union pledges to satisfy the mine manager during a strike at Little Glace Bay in 1868. An example of one of these pledges written by a local minister, it declared the following, quote, "The bearer hereof, Angus McPherson, has, I understand, been a member of one of those union meetings, but declares that hereafter he shall take no part whatever in them. I know Angus well, and I feel I can rely upon what he says." End quote. Memories of the draconian authority of the mine managers and its extension to the church were also revealed in stories from older miners about Lingan, recalled by Francis McEuen in 1976. McEuen reported, "The manager went around with a long black frock and a big hat. He went in church on Sunday and the crowd just parted. Nobody watched the priest or minister. They were all looking at the manager." Um, Donald Link, a Presbyterian Gael, was likely the individual that McEuen was identifying in this oral history testimony. Section 3, the rise of the Provincial Workmen's Association. Threatening notices, such as this one in this slide, um, and this one was posted at Little Glace Bay in 1868. Um, they were almost certainly not new to the coal field at that time, as the Cape Breton News had reported on notices posted at Sydney mines 4 years earlier, designed to, quote, arouse the fears of other workmen, unquote. And we find similar notices reappearing at Sydney mines in 1876 during another bitter strike, which again ended in the defeat of the miners. Anonymous threats of this kind, which seemingly mimicked the coffin notices commonly associated with the Molly Maguires in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, were symptomatic of fears of immediate retribution, and thus in many ways evidenced the political weakness of the miners rather than their strength. However, the expansion of coal production to the south side of the coal field beginning in the 1860s altered the political and economic environment in important ways. The composite highland communities that were reassembled at the mines not only included mine workers, but it also included religious leaders as well as merchants and politicians who could themselves be influenced by broader developments within the coal community. Take, for example, William MacDonald, born in Cape Breton at River Dennis Mountain in 1837, of a mother and father who had migrated from Barra and South Eust, respectively, in the late 1820s. Raised on the family homestead at River Dennis Mountain, MacDonald briefly attended St. Francis Xavier College before relocating to teach school in the Grand Narrows area at Iona, identified here on the map. And he did that in 1859. 2 years later, 1861, he moves to the village of Lingan. He initially worked as a school teacher, but within a few years he had removed himself to neighboring Little Glace Bay, where he wed Catherine MacDonald, sister of Ronald MacDonald, who ran the GMA's company store at Lingan. At Little Glace Bay, William MacDonald became involved in trade on his own account and was already sufficiently prominent in 1866 to be asked to locate a residence for Little Glace Bay's newly appointed resident pastor, Father John Shaw, one of the earliest students at St. Francis Xavier College to be ordained. Because MacDonald migrated to the coal mining district with many other Catholic Gaels from rural Cape Breton, he was firmly situated within dense social networks, which facilitated his entry into politics. He reported in 1872, quote, "The leaders of the people round here of every class urge me to try for the position of representative," end quote. He ran successfully as an independent conservative for Cape Breton County in 1872 and was reelected in three subsequent elections before his appointment to the Senate in 1884. So he becomes an influential political figure, both in Glace Bay, but also within the Conservative Party more generally. MacDonald was among a wider group of merchants who became a political force largely independent from the coal operators, and his political effectiveness was largely rooted in his ability to function as an effective broker and representative to the wider mining community. When a miners' union, the Provincial Workmen's Association, or PWA, first established on the Nova Scotia mainland at Spring Hill in 1879, began to organize in Cape Breton in the early 1880s, MacDonald's political orientation was largely determined by local opinion. Consequently, he was considered a supporter of the union during its lengthy strike at Lingan against the General Mining Association in 1882-83. In one of several dramatic moments during the strike, the GMA sought to import more than 30 Scottish miners, mainly from Lanarkshire, to act as strikebreakers. But upon their arrival in Cape Breton, they refused to work for the GMA and joined the union instead. One company director bristled at the behavior of what he described as, quote, those scoundrels of colliers from Scotland, end quote. The decision of these miners to join the union was facilitated by the fact that a neighboring colliery at Little Glace Bay, sympathetic to the miners' union, had agreed to hire them to work in the mines. And the episode has also been recounted by Canadian songwriter and musician Maria Dunn in her song titled The Lingan Strike. The victory of the miners in that strike demonstrated their ability to redirect established sources of local authority towards their cause. The old depiction of rural Gaels as strikebreakers nonetheless was articulated during the period of the Lingan strike. The Provincial Workmen's Association newspaper, the Trades Journal, provided the following in what was certainly meant as a character portrait of Donald Link, the colliery boss at Lingan. Quote, from being a driver of horses, he was promoted to drive men, and he became adept at it. Though at first, from his imperfect knowledge of languages, he used to confound English with Big Bredor and Bedeck Gaelic, and any Inverness man knows what such a mixture would produce. End quote. But the ability of men such as Link to command the labor of rural migrants was substantially displaced by the new Union presence. The miners commanded considerable support from local merchants and politicians, which left the GMA politically isolated. With these developments, the political loyalties within the composite Highland community at the mines shifted towards the Union. In the midst of the strike in September 1882, the 2-year anniversary of the PWA was celebrated in public displays across the coalfield. In the Glace Bay area and at Sydney Mines, mass processions were followed with gatherings that featured the bagpipes, the fiddle, and step dancing. Highland culture thus revealed itself as an embedded feature of Cape Breton's coal communities. We might say that the Yahi miners had become, to a considerable extent, union miners. Part 4. A distinctive feature of the coal communities was the persisting importance of the rural context, as the seasonal rhythms of Cape Breton's mines reinforced patterns of ongoing migration to and from the countryside. Until the consolidation of the mines on the south side of the coal field by the Dominion Coal Company in 1893 and the connection of the mines to a winter port at Louisbourg, until then, coal shipments from Sydney Harbor and other outports were halted from January until the spring thaw in April or May. The seasonal nature of mine work depressed annual wages and reinforced the combination of mining with farming. The period from the 1860s to the 1890s was in many ways a period of transition marked by the coexistence of tradition with new modes of industrial capitalist authority and organization. One enduring tradition during this period was the communion festivals that had been transferred from Scotland by Presbyterian Gaels. These 5 days festivals were widespread in Cape Breton during this period. Beginning in 1852, the banks of the Myra River emerged as a favored venue. A communion festival held in Sydney Mines the following year witnessed expressions of deep feeling, including bitter cries. Outdoor communion persisted at Sydney Mines until the 1870s. The tradition was sustained for a period amidst the seasonal rhythms of the coal trade. Born from a world of work organized around seasons, the Communion Festival was in decline before the end of the century. As Laurie Stanley Blackwell has argued, increasingly it became anathema in a world increasingly governed by clocks. Yet the transition to the new industrial world was powerfully shaped by established patterns and connections to the Cape Breton countryside, which reinforced kin networks and common experiences. Writing from Glace Bay in the 1920s, one person declared, quote, "Every man has relatives and friends and neighbors. The entire population is with them. The managing operator is the floater. He shifts every 3 or 4 years and sees only the dollar in the vision. He has no stake in the community, no love for the people," end quote. Such statements, of course, need to be assessed in historical context, recognizing that from the turn of the 20th century, racial and ethnic difference often attenuated the meaning of community belonging within industrial Cape Breton's increasingly diverse working class population. But without doubt, rural migration and with it, the strengthening of the Highland element was a major factor in reinforcing social cohesion of the coal towns. But the image of the Highlander as a romantic pre-modern figure has, as elsewhere, distorted the historical reality of Cape Breton's coal towns. Hugh McLennan's 1951 novel, Each Man's Son, for instance, offers a fictionalized reconstruction of early 20th century Glace Bay that registers the prominent presence of the prominent Gaelic presence in the coal towns. McLennan represents life in the coal town as yet another tragic episode in the history of the Highlander, whom he constructs as a romantic figure unequipped to adapt to the conditions of modern industrial society. In his foreword to the book, McLennan claims that the courage and independence of the Highlanders had enabled them to prolong their doomed resistance to, quote, Saxon civilization, end quote. McLennan writes, quote, "They had come to the end of the 18th century knowing nothing of the foreman, the boss, the politician, the policeman, the merchant, or the buyer and seller of other men's work," end quote. According to McLennan's schema, migration to Cape Breton allowed Highlanders to evade a direct encounter with modernity for another century. The Gaelic characters of the coal town thus appear in the novel as tragic figures, unable to cope with modernity and prone to fighting and drinking. One such character in the novel was Magistrate McEuen, a local judge among the throng of inebriated men who streamed out of the saloons on Saturday night. The judge was only restrained from joining in fights that followed when reminded of his position. And in McLennan's book, he talks about sort of the main corner in the town, which the town he calls Broughton, but it's really Glace Bay. And the main corner he calls McDonald's Corner, which in reality it's Senator's Corner in Glace Bay, actually named after the senator who we encountered a few minutes earlier, William McDonald. Um, so in effect, that's McLennan's depiction of Glace Bay and his depiction of McKeegan, a character that was almost certainly based upon a real historical figure. Magistrate McKeegan was almost certainly based upon a real person. This person here, A.B. McGillivray, who was appointed magistrate of Glace Bay upon the town's incorporation in 1901. A.B. McGillivray, or simply A.B. as he was known locally, became a local folk character in Glace Bay, known for his common sense, judgments, and wit. A biographical portrait published in the Glace Bay Post Record from 1933 reported the following, quote, "When A.B. is out of court, he likes nothing better than to get together with a group of old cronies, most of them Scottish, who spin yarns in their native tongue, which he speaks fluently. As a matter of fact, his friends say jokingly that he is an accomplished linguist in 3 tongues, the English language on the bench, Gaelic when with his Scotch friends, and bad language when he's riled." This image of McGillivray as a local magistrate with no formal legal training, but whose application of the law and wit received widespread endorsement from the coal community, would really define the way that McGillivray would be remembered in the 20th century and even today. Less well known is the fact that McGilvery's ascent to the bench in Glace Bay built upon his earlier career as a leader for the miners' union, the PWA, in the 19th century. A Catholic Gael born in Grand Narrows in 1858, McGilvery experienced the transition from the seasonal rhythms of the farm to a full immersion in the new industrial world that was born on the coal fields. He first left for the mines at the age of 13. The first decade of his working life was, in all probability, oriented towards the support of his family at Grand Narrows, suggested by his appearance in the 1881 census in Grand Narrows in a household with his younger siblings and widowed mother. Marriage in 1882 to Katie Johnston, born in Iona, likely signaled a more permanent shift to the mining district. By 1891, the couple had 3 children, and Katie's widowed mother was also living with them at Little Glace Bay. McGilvery reported living in a company house in 1888. Credited as the founder of the Provincial Workmen's Association Keystone Lodge at Little Glace Bay, McGilvery rose to become the most important figure within the union in Cape Breton before the end of the century. McGilvery's ascent coincided with an entrenchment of the local PWA presence, which included the winning of significant reforms from the Liberal provincial government. In consultation with the PWA Grand Secretary, Robert Drummond, the Liberal government passed legislation in areas such as certification, education, and arbitration, and the government also extended the franchise to miners living in company houses in 1889. Speaking before a union gathering that year, McGilvery credited the PWA with, quote, obtaining concessions and reforms which are far too numerous and various to be even hastily enumerated, and with elevating the miners above the insults and humiliations with which we were so cruelly beset in bygone days. McGilvery would also access the new patronage opportunities within the state created by the provincial government. In 1892, he was appointed to the Board of Examiners for the certification of mining officials. He was also ensconced in local affairs as a member of the Board of School Trustees. And in 1894, he was appointed stipendiary magistrate for his local district. Ultimately, McGilvery's connections to the Liberal Party would result in his appointment as magistrate for Glace Bay in 1901. Conclusions. Contrary to the mythology of the Highlander as a romantic, pre-modern figure trapped in the past, migrants from Highland enclave settlements to Cape Breton's mining district demonstrated creative and often effective responses to the new realities of industrial society. While figures such as William MacDonald and A.B. McGilvery assumed positions of influence, they did so within the boundaries of brokerage politics and had limited command over popular attitudes. The establishment of a trade union presence arose from collective action of the coal communities that bent brokerage politics and elevated figures who reflected and were willing to submit to popular pressures. But by the early 20th century, MacDonald and McGilvery were already in some respects figures of an earlier age, and the PWA had in effect become a company union, eventually replaced by District 26 of the United Mine Workers of America. As we saw in the introduction of the talk, a lowland Scot, shaped by the ideas of Keir Hardie, J.B. McLaughlin, would play a leading role in the new unionism of the early 20th century. Yet, migration from rural to industrial Cape Breton would persist as the coal industry underwent unprecedented expansion in the 20th century. There is suggestive evidence to suggest that this dynamic had significant downstream consequences. Dramatic episodes of labor unrest from the decisive 1925 coal strike had 19th century antecedents, as popular agency on the coalfield vacillated between traditionalism and radicalism and militancy with apparent ease. The Scottish factor in Cape Breton's coal mining communities presents a unique history of cultural transmission that has yet to be fully apprehended and explained, rooted more in class politics than in the realm of essentialized ethnic identities. It is a history characterized by the fluid and transnational character of region and locality rather than national frameworks of analysis. As works such as Alistair MacLeod's No Great Mischief and Kate Beaton's graphic novel Ducks remind us, migrations for work at sites of resource extraction continued in the 20th century and continue in this century among Cape Bretoners and forge an aspect of a common identity. The past continues to echo in the present. Thank you.
Well, hello, Professor Nerbas. I want to express my deepest apologies for not being able to access the Zoom, but I did manage to get on at the outset of your presentation, and I would like to say it was absolutely excellent, fascinating, and just all new information for me. So thank you so much. I'd like to invite everyone to unmute your microphones, please, and turn on your cameras again so that we can engage with Professor Nerbas. I'm wondering, Professor, I guess I'm struck by the similarities between the displaced Highlanders who migrated to New Britain and generations later were put to work in the coal mines, and the Scots and Ulster Scots who migrated to West Virginia and experienced a similar fate. I'm just wondering, did the New Britain squatters realize that they had settled illegally at the time of their initial arrival on the island?
Yeah, that's something that there would have been an awareness of it, and actually one of the complications around that history is it includes resistance to actually the surveying of land, because one of the memories of dispossession in the Highlands was that the arrival of surveyors was really the first phase of dispossession. So in many ways there is um, a continuation or a different version of that history that's being played out in Cape Breton. And so despite the fact that, people had been uh, sort of settling for decades, the actual progression of the surveying of land itself was pretty underdeveloped until the middle years of the 19th century. And in fact, one of the concerns on the part of the colonial government is sort of this concern that Highlanders are in the woods squandering resources, chopping trees down, and they're not producing economic development. And that's again, just in terms of thinking about the way that the history of Scotland plays out in the North American environment, you also see that happening with this history where you do have people coming from the lowlands. One of the deputy commissioner of Crown Lands is from Scotland, and he has very negative attitudes towards Gaels and towards Gaelic. And this is something that he mentions in his correspondence to the Commissioner of Crown Lands in Halifax. So it's quite the Scottish influence from many sides. It comes out. Yeah, absolutely.
I just have one other quick question. I'll go ahead. Have the Presbyterian Gaelic festivals continued until modern times?
They've largely died out. They don't really, but they do extend into the 20th century. Really, the high point is the 1850s, 1860s. It becomes, by the time you get to the 20th century, the influence of mass consumer society is being felt. And so the sort of religiosity of the event is sort of eroding to some extent by that period. But they do persist into the 20th century. And Laurie Stanley Blackwell has a nice book on the subject as well. And so she's documented that the evolution of these communion festivals, which were mass events. Like you have as many as 5 to 6,000 people attending these outdoor communion festivals, which would occur over a 5-day period.
Questions, comments?
I have a question about when Prince Edward Island became a separate province. I've done some research in Scotland, and it turned out what I thought were my relatives migrated to Nova Scotia, and I was saying, "Oh, that can't be them because they're from Prince Edward Island." But I think at the time it was part of Nova Scotia. And so my genealogy probably was correct.
Um, that's so it is separate. It is St. John's Island, although I it's always possible that maybe Nova Scotia is put down as so the thing with Prince Edward Island is the region is complicated because it's being claimed by the French and British at the same time. It's Acadia for the French, it's Nova Scotia for the British, and actually the boundaries of Nova Scotia becomes part of a diplomatic question between the French and the British. And so there is a way in which the boundaries of Nova Scotia are shifting. New Brunswick is established as New Brunswick had been part of Nova Scotia. It's established as a separate loyalist colony in 1784, the same time that happens for Cape Breton. Um, the unique aspect of Prince Edward Island, though, is that the land, these big estates, the land is divided to big estates, and it's essentially given out in a lottery. And you have, which is very unique, the persistence of a system of landlordism in Prince Edward Island that doesn't sort of make itself felt anywhere else in the maritime region. Um,
So it's a little more complicated.
yeah, what years are you looking at in terms of migration?
Well, he was born in 1841 in Scotland, in Isle of Skye, and then he
Yeah,
left for Boston in 1896.
okay, yeah, they would have been different then. Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia would have been different for sure then. Yeah.
Okay.
John Cameron, do you have your hand up?
I do.
Yay. Good.
I was interested in the parallels between, the political and labor developments in Cape Breton, the area that you just discussed, with what was actually happening in lowland Scotland at the time, in terms of both the extension of the franchise, the rise of the Liberal Party, but also then subsequently the rise of union organizing, and ultimately the Independent Labor Party. And I was wondering if that's a more general pattern throughout Canada in terms of the rise of the expansion of the franchise, resulting in the growth of the labor movement and the increasing kind of democratization of society.
Yeah, there are definitely connections with the lowlands in terms of the timing of developments. In general, the franchise in British North America would have been broader than in Britain during the 19th century. But it's certainly the case, as I mentioned in the talk, that the property qualification within Nova Scotia that was required to vote meant that miners living in company houses were not able to exercise the franchise until legislation in 1889. Um, you see in the case of Nova Scotia a direct influence on labor organizing. I had mentioned Robert Drummond. He's the organizer of the Provincial Workmen's Association, and it's been sort of argued in many ways that he is sort of the Alexander MacDonald of Nova Scotia's labor movement, that he's influenced by labor leaders around the time of his migration to Nova Scotia. And by the time you get to the 1890s and the early 20th century, the new unionism is influencing migrants from Scotland who are arriving in Canada, including in Cape Breton, and that's creating political conflict within Cape Breton. So, as I mentioned, J.B. McLaughlin arrives in Cape Breton around 1900 from Scotland. He's influenced by Keir Hardie. He's influenced by the new modes of industrial organizing. And he very much is bringing Scottish ideas to his understanding of events in Cape Breton, including his life. I think, we had been, there was some discussion about Burns and sort of um, the political implications of Burns, and that was something that McLaughlin also ascribed to strongly, that he sort of held up Burns as a figure who, had he been born in the early 20th century, he would have been an international socialist. That was sort of McLaughlin's reading of Burns's tradition. So absolutely, there are definitely parallels, and in the Provincial Workmen's Association newspaper too. Um, there are also articles that appear about the crofters in the 1880s, so there is a flow of information back and forth in this period. Yeah.
Thank you.
Keisha, do you have a question, Keisha?
Yes, ma'am, I do. Um, so I think the last time I was here was January. I'm a Scottish African American and Native American historian from North Carolina. But my husband, I've invited his last name or family name is Valentine. They came through Canada to migrate into the United States in the early 1900s, 1940s. I'm not too sure. But was that common? Was that more common, I guess, in the early to mid 1900s to come through Canada first before entering? I believe they came through Michigan. And I, as a historian, have more commonly heard more of Ellis Island, the East Coast, migrants, or of course North and South Carolina as Scottish welcoming states. But what I really don't know much of it, and so that's one of the reasons I've joined this group, is to kind of gauge more for him.
Nice.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think so one of the things that's happening in the background of the whole period that I was looking at is outmigration is actually extremely common. So, working in the mines was one possibility, but oftentimes migration to this US was happening in significant numbers, including in the case of Cape Breton, it's Boston. In the Maritimes, New England is known as the Boston States because you have so many people, moving to Boston, and there are again sort of a reassembling of communities because people don't migrate often as individuals; they migrate as part of a larger group. Um, but it is the case. So you have that history of outmigration occurring. The unique thing about industrial Cape Breton is the how rapid um, economic growth in the industrial area is in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that actually reverses that pattern, and you have significant in-migration occurring, including migration from different places. So I mentioned like Southern Eastern Europe, There's significant numbers of people coming from the Caribbean to work in the steel plant and in the coal mines in the early 20th century, which is creating a multiracial community in industrial Cape Breton. But so there is a lot of um, movement that's occurring, but it's really a moment because the period of expansion is largely over by the end of the First World War, and so you have again another period of migration. So that's just to say that a lot of people in other parts of North America might have connections to Cape Breton and places like that that they wouldn't know because of this history of outmigration that so many people end up you know
Was it was it easier migration because Canada was like a British, still under the British umbrella? Like, did it make it easier for Scottish and Irish immigrants instead of, I don't know, like was it difficult at all for certain
um
people to come just straight to the United States? Is that why maybe there was this uh, group
yeah
on the border of Canada before coming? Uh,
yeah that I mean because I think that gets into a bigger question. So you do have a lot of migration direct to the United States in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century period as well. Um, One of the aspects of the longer history that produces Highland migration in British North America is also like military service within, for the British Army. That's a way to actually gain access to land, gain land grants, was through military service. And so that's one of the reasons for some of the sort of Highland enclave settlements that you see sort of emerging in this period. But yeah, you have, I think, different forms of migration because the type of migration that brings sort of Highlanders to uh, Cape Breton is largely what has been described as like provincial migration. It's group migration and it's chain migration where it reproduces in a way the same communities in North America, and is one of the reasons why you have the persistence of Gaelic in the 19th century is because the sort of the resettlement of people in relatively isolated rural areas sort of allows for the persistence of Gaelic over a longer period of time. Uh, but in terms of, yeah, the broader history of migration, a lot of times like coal companies themselves are recruiting laborers. So like that's another thing in terms of like the role of the state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Like the government itself remains like pretty small in a lot of ways. Like the immigration department of the Canadian Pacific Railway at the beginning of the 20th century is bigger than the federal government's um, immigration department. It's so a lot of times the migration that you're sort of seeing in the late 19th, early 20th century um, is part of um, efforts on the part of companies to actually bring migrants for particular opportunities, and so that's also a history that often produces remigration when people it gives people an opportunity to get a job in a place, but if they end up not liking that particular area, they might move to somewhere that has better sort of prospects.
and that's kind of what my HBCU, when we did our European history in North Carolina. Uh, there were just certain groupings. You just said cheap labor. That was one. Another thing that our professor said when he actually had to go to Ireland was certain dioceses, I guess, like where there was a grouping of certain Catholic churches, that was also I guess, an indicator, like when the family came over first and it was like, okay, then they would come. Um, but I, I guess it makes sense in my head because there are two separate parts of my husband's side that came directly to Detroit specifically, in which there
Oh,
were
okay.
factories, and then they migrated elsewhere. And so
Oh,
that's
okay.
a little different from like my Scottish family that were farmers in the South. So it's it's interesting comparing our family because he has more paperwork than I do per se. But it's like the cultural part. My father did his due justice while he of making sure that I don't know why he wanted us to learn Gaelic, but he did just as long with German. But thank you for answering that
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
because
So, yeah.
Can I make a comment? I've
Yes,
done
Bill.
some work.
Bill, and I have a question for you in a minute, and then Alfred, and then John Cameron, and then I believe we need to conclude. But please proceed, Bill.
Yeah, in Halifax, there's a place called Pier 21, and it's the Ellis Island of that area. And the reason people go there is it's cheaper than several multiple days to travel down to New York or Boston or any of the US ports. It's much closer to Europe. And then take the Trans-Canadian Railroad across Canada and then cross into the US border because there was no border patrol or anything to stop anyone from migrating from Canada into US. So that is a possibility.
hmm
And
Yeah, there's
Pier
very
21 has a good website
mhm,
that you can do some research, and I found quite a bit there.
mhm.
Thanks, Bill. Alfred, did you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, I thought you did. Okay, John Cameron.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the Keisha's questions about the migration through Detroit. After the First World War, there was a huge boom of Scottish emigration to the U.S., and very frequently they would take the relatively cheap transatlantic steamers from out of the Clyde over to Quebec and then down through Montreal, and then then travel by railroad through Detroit. And Detroit itself became had the largest Scottish population of recent immigrants by 1930 because of the huge boom in the auto industry in the area. And obviously, as Keisha was saying, then her antecedents migrated from there. But it was very common in that early 20th century, after the First World War, for Scots to emigrate first to Canada and then into the U.S. And of course, the U.S. is, as the industrialization and the boom of the 20s drew also from longtime Canadian Scots who were from more rural areas, and so there was always also a stream of immigrants from Canada into the U.S. From Canadians who were originally rural Scots who settled earlier in the 19th century in Canada. So that's a very common pattern that she was mentioning.
Yeah, no, and it's something you see also in Canada I have a student actually who's working on the history of Verdun, which is now part of Montreal. It used to be its separate municipality. And it becomes a residential neighborhood for a working class community, sort of in the western portion of Montreal. And they're skilled industrial workers. And the Scottish portion of that workforce is very considerable as well. So the timing of that is it matches up pretty exactly. And just a sort of anecdote to add to what you mentioned about Detroit. I believe I'm correct in thinking that the singer Jack White in the White Stripes, I think his grandparents were from Sydney Mines, and they ended up in Detroit. His real name's Angus Gillis, I think. So it's again that migration from Canada to Detroit to find work. Yeah, it's happening.
Well, very, 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 very interesting, Don. And I'm thinking you probably have a lot more to share, and maybe we can have you back to speak on another topic soon. But I just want to thank you. It was a wonderful presentation, and everyone I know is just mesmerized by this subject. So I'll be in touch, and we'd like to have you elaborate in the near future, please.
Yeah.
Just a quick reminder for everybody. Next month on April 11th, Giles Ingram, the chief executive at Abbotsford, which is the home of Sir Walter Scott, will be with us to discuss the world of Sir Walter Scott. So I hope everyone can join us then. I'd like to conclude the meeting formally right now, but if you'd like to stay on and chit chat a little bit longer, I'll leave the Zoom going. But Professor Nerbas, that was just excellent, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, and I just got a message. We're going to be disconnected. So thank you one and all. Have a great day.